Hey folks, welcome to Black Gumbo. I thought today I would talk about where two of my interests collide, and that is in gardening and in books. So I'm sitting out here, it's a beautiful day. I like to read and study and do my work outside when the spring allows me to, and I thought I'd show you some books that I think might interest fellow gardeners. I like to read about gardens and gardening books, things that old books, antiquarian books about gardens, and these two, Down the Garden Path, this was written in 1934. It's about the experiences of just living in a gardening culture. And English gardening is a lot different than what we have here. French gardening. This book, French Dirt, by Richard Goodman. This is more of a memoir of the author's time when he moved to a very small village in France and took up gardening. And it's more of a general get the flavor of the south of France and his experience learning to garden. And he was there for a year, and it's a pretty good book. I enjoy it. This is the kind of thing you read if you just like to hear about people and to hear about their experiences and getting their hands dirty. But you know, there's also a lot of reading that you ought to do if you're trying to learn gardening. Now, there are several kinds of approaches to gardening. There's hobby gardening, where you're keeping nice little tidy beds and containers, and that's kind of what I do. There's sustenance gardening, where you're growing on your land to sustain yourself and actually feed yourself and maybe be self-sustainable. That's a little bit larger. Then there's commercial gardening or farming, you know, where you're growing like what they used to call a truck farm around here. You're growing to sell. And there's a fellow up in Canada I follow who exemplifies this a lot. I'll link to his channel. He's growing on a small plot, but he's making a living at it. And he's doing so with sustainable methods, no-till. And so we can all learn from each other, actually. I can't really apply some of the methods I read about and learn about on the grand and large scale, but I can apply some of what I learn. I'll show you one of the books that's really been helpful to me. That is Steve Solomon's Gardening When It Counts. Now, Solomon's talking about you gotta make a living, you gotta feed yourself, and you want your garden to perform well and maximize. And so this isn't the kind of gardening you would do if you want a pretty square foot gardening backyard plot. This is if you've got a couple of acres and you want to really make your plants grow well. He teaches you how to do that and how to not use a tiller, what the problems are with tilling and why it forms a hard pan, and over time tilling is destructive to your soil. You could take some of those methods and apply them in a small plot, though, and that's what I've done with slowly and gradually I'm learning about no-till gardening. Solomon also in his book talks about composting and how to compost and things that you can compost, and that was revolutionary to me because, you know, if you buy yourself one of those little composting little buckets you turn over, you might get yourself, you know, a gallon of compost. But if you are needing buckets full of compost and gardens full of compost, Solomon really tells you how to get that done. He also talks about things you can put in there. So Solomon's book is really eye-opening for some good methods that, while they're tailored for the large-scale gardener, you can also apply a lot of what you learn to the backyard garden. There's another book I've appreciated. It's The Tomato in America, and this is a book about the history of tomatoes, and you really learn a lot. I mean, tomatoes have actually a rather dedicated following. Some people only garden tomatoes, and they garden so that they can make the most of various varieties, and they literally collect varieties like you would collect coins or stamps or something. And that's great, man. I kind of do that with figs, but I only have limited space, and so yeah, a lot of people really love tomatoes. Pepper folks are the same way. People get passionate about peppers, and you know. So yeah, this is a great little history about the tomato. It's an easy read. It's an informative read, and if you like tomatoes, and you want a book about tomatoes and you're really into tomatoes, this will give you a lot of info. There's recipes in here. You learn about where the tomato came from and how the tomato was vilified for so many years because people thought the thing was poisonous. And gives you the history of the beginnings of some of the most famous strains of tomatoes and some of the heirloom types that have come about. And I think it's a fabulous little book. If you're into gardening tomatoes, this is something I recommend. Tomato in America by Andrew F. Smith. But really, if you're into gardening heirloom stuff at all, you probably know about Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds and the Gettle family. They have written a book called The Heirloom Life Gardener, and this is a really fascinating book, profusely illustrated. Gives you kind of the background, the history of Baker Creek, a lot of information about how they went about finding seeds and how to grow these things. And it's just a really good, informative book. If you don't want to, if you like books, this is a good one to have for growing heirlooms. I like heirlooms. I prefer heirlooms. I prefer them because it's just kind of the pure. It's more pure to me. I can save the seed. I don't do a lot of seed saving, but I save some seed. Seed grows true to type when you garden with heirlooms, and there's just kind of a culture and a history behind an heirloom seed that you don't get with some of the hybrids. No, there's nothing wrong with hybrids. I'm growing hybrids right now, some hybrid tomatoes, and you know, some hybrids are as old and storied as some heirlooms are, but and there's benefits to hybrids as well. But for me, I just kind of like the history and the culture of the garden. And so some of these books are really good reading and really informative. I also garden muscadines, and if you're into muscadines, you probably have heard about Greg Ison and Isons Vineyard and Nursery. And they write this book. It's a thin little book. It's a booklet, but muscadines. I'm growing muscadines, and my muscadine vineyard's doing well because I follow Greg's methods. These guys have really mastered the varieties of muscadine. They've developed some various strains of muscadines, and they know a lot about it, and they're commercial growers. So I think Greg is probably the master. And this book's by his father, William Ison. And it's a good book, good to have. Teaches you how to cultivate these things. So yeah, if you're into gardening, I hope you're also into reading, because reading there's not a lot of readers these days, and I like to read a lot. I read basically as part of my day job. I'm a pastor, so I study most of the week, and so I'm doing a lot of reading. But I also read for enjoyment, and I try to read broadly, and gardening counts in that read broadly category. So yeah, pick up some books.